Every time some new technology in the gaming world flops, what's usually the first thing you hear? It was ahead of its time, dude! Yup, it's the most common excuse in the book. The tech was too advanced at the time it was released, and that's why it didn't succeed. Sure, whatever makes you sleep at night. But seriously though, sometimes tech actually is too advanced for its own good and fails because the rest of the world hadn't caught up to it just yet. Nintendo and Sega have experienced this so many times. The Virtual Boy was supposed to be the next big thing in gaming back in the 90s. Sure, it ended up being one of the rare fails from Nintendo, but it wasn't all bad. Okay, it was mostly bad, since it didn't do anything it promised. But it did lay the foundation for what was to become virtual reality. The Virtual Boy was supposed to take players and put them inside of their favorite games. But all it did was really put you in this horrible mess of red-tinted graphics, and the console itself was just incredibly uncomfortable. Nintendo had the right idea with the Virtual Boy. It was just way too soon. The technology of the 90s just wasn't good enough for VR yet, and it showed as the Virtual Boy ended up being ahead of its time by a good 20 years. Sticking with the 90s, I feel like the Sega Dreamcast was one of the most underrated consoles of that decade. If the Dreamcast had a middle name, it'd be Innovation, because this system was the definition of ahead of its time. Just think of all the innovative games that were available for the console. There was Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, Phantasy Star Online, Sonic Adventure 2, and so much more. On top of all that, the Sega Dreamcast was the first console in the world to include a built-in modem for online play. Sounds a lot like the Xbox that was released a few years later, doesn't it? The Dreamcast had so much potential, but Sega forgot about something crucial: third-party support. There weren't many quality games coming out for the console, so naturally it ended up dying out rather quickly. Oh, the Power Glove. Almost nothing screams 80s as loud as the Power Glove. On paper, the Power Glove sounded incredible because it enabled you to play games using motion controls. What? Are you kidding me? Motion controls? In the 80s? Yeah, the Power Glove was well ahead of its time, but its execution was lacking. There isn't a game out there for the Super Nintendo that actually worked well with the Power Glove. Sure, it looked cool as heck at the time, but it was just as gimmicky as you could get. Nowadays, it's just a relic of gaming's past that sells for a good chunk of change online. But it did give birth to motion controls in gaming. Nintendo would learn from their mistakes and would dominate sales with the Wii, and its much improved motion controls many years later. So I think it all worked out in the end. Nintendo had the Nintendo Power Magazine, the Power Glove, and even the Power Pad. It's safe to say they loved the word power. The Power Pad is pretty much exactly what you'd expect. It was a pad you'd lay down on the floor that allowed you to play games by stepping on buttons. Nintendo heard all the criticism from parents of gamers everywhere. Video games make children fat and lazy. My son does nothing but eat and play video games. It was a popular viewpoint at the time, so Nintendo said hold my beer and released the Power Pad to give it to all those criticizing the lifestyle of their gamers. Sadly for Nintendo, the Power Pad flopped. Its games didn't sell well at all. But what's one man's junk is another man's treasure. Konami would later use the Power Pad as inspiration to make their own game known as Dance Dance Revolution, and the rest, as they say, is history. Like I said earlier, the Dreamcast was the first console to have a built-in modem, but the Famicom, known as the NES in North America, was the first console to have a modem add-on. This wasn't just your run-of-the-mill modem though. It was specifically designed for the Japanese market. You see, Japan's economy in the late 80s was booming, so day traders needed some way to trade stocks online. Naturally, Nintendo saw this as an opportunity to make their console capable of trading stock online through the Famicom Modem. Of course, it wasn't used for just stock trading, but that was its main use. It was also used to download video game cheats, jokes, weather forecasts, and a small amount of downloadable content. Oh, and you could also use it to bet on horse racing. Yeah, that's very specific. The Famicom Modem was a little too ahead of its time. Did you know that the movie I, Robot starring Will Smith was the pioneer for gaming tech that was ahead of its time? Well, it wasn't. But the arcade game I, Robot, on the other hand, that's a different story. Released in 1984, iRobot was a huge flop. Only between 750 and 1,000 units were created, and very few still exist today. But if you somehow have one of these lying around, they could fetch you a pretty penny. It's unlikely though. The gameplay was kinda bad, honestly, but it was innovative in many other aspects. For starters, it was the first game to have filled 3D polygon graphics with flat shading, which means it had N64 and PS1S graphics in 1984. It was also the first game to have camera control options, something that is standard in pretty much all modern games. Despite its flaws, that's the reason why iRobot is considered one of the video game classics. The Laserscope has to be one of the most hilarious-looking gaming gadgets of all time. It looks like a Lego headset. While it wasn't the best-looking piece of tech, the Laserscope was released in 1991 and was very innovative. You wore it on your head with the microphone in front of your mouth, and an eyepiece with a crosshair in front of your right eye. The Laserscope was designed for the game Laser Invasion, and when you said fire, it was supposed to, you guessed it, fire at the target in your crosshairs. Reviewers complained about how the Laserscope didn't always respond to the voice commands, but just the fact that it even had voice commands was crazy. Plus, the Laserscope could even double as an NES headset, so it was well ahead of its time. Only 20 years later would we really get to see voice commands become more prevalent in games. The XBAND had nothing to do with the Xbox, or even a Rock Band for that matter. Instead, it allowed you to take your gaming experience on the SNES or Sega Genesis to 100. Released in 1994 for Genesis and 1995 for SNES, the XBAND was the first online console gaming network ever. It's essentially the founding father of online gaming. You could use the XBAND to do so much. It was mainly used to play with or against others online, but it could also keep track of a friends list, download newsletters, look at leaderboards, and so much more. It was essentially a dumbed-down version of Xbox Live, PlayStation Network, or Nintendo Switch Online before those were even a thought. You've heard of PlayStation Now, Xbox Game Pass, and Nvidia GeForce Now. But have you ever heard of the Sega Channel? That's right, the Sega Channel was the OG on-demand gaming service. It allowed gamers to stream digital content to the Sega Mega Drive through cable television. Yup, it turns out that streaming was a thing all the way back in 1994. Even if it's not the same type of streaming we have today, the Sega Channel also enabled you to play game demos and download cheats. So, what went wrong with the Sega Channel? It had a poorly timed launch and a ridiculously high subscription fee, which led to its downfall. But damn was it innovative at the time. Somewhat related to the Sega Channel was the Satellaview for the SNES or Super Famicom, as it was known outside of North America. The Satellaview was the satellite modem released in 1995 that you attached underneath the Super Famicom, which used the ST Giga broadcasting system. ST Giga broadcasted for an hour each day, and only then could gamers download games, magazines, and other content. While that all sounds super neat, the Satellaview used satellite radio, which meant it couldn't have multiplayer features. Bummer. It was essentially the successor to the Famicom Modem. It improved all things gaming related and got rid of the ability to trade stocks and bet on horse races. That's a big win in my book. And those were just some of the gaming tech I'd consider ahead of its time. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Intellivision console, the UForce game controller, and the Vectrex 3D imager for pushing innovation back in the day as well. What piece of gaming tech do you think was well ahead of its time? Let me know in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to TheGamer for more retro gaming content. Thanks for watching.